On Christmas night, sometime in the early 1800s, Monticello fell into a silence so complete that even the wind withdrew. No hymns, no laughter, no bells, just absence. By morning, the plantation returned to its rituals as if nothing had happened. Fires were lit, orders were given, work resumed, and yet, one detail was never recorded in the official ledgers. The enslaved quarters were missing people. Not bodies, not blood, people. They reappeared by dawn. Every man, woman, and child accounted for. No marks, no injuries, no explanation. This story does not survive in textbooks. It survives in whispers, passed down through families who were never meant to remember. They called it the Christmas release. The masters called it mercy. The enslaved called it something else entirely, but that word was never written down. Monticello, perched like a temple above Virginia soil, was a place of Enlightenment ideals. Reason, order, faith and progress. But beneath the philosophy lived a contradiction so violent it had to be ritualized to survive. Christmas was not a day of freedom here. It was a performance. Once a year, the enslaved were allowed what was described as celebration, food, rest, music, prayer. Visitors wrote of cheerfulness, of grateful souls, of contented servants praising God. But none of them stayed after midnight. Because when the mountain went silent, something older than celebration took its turn. This documentary follows a forgotten tradition, one hidden inside Christian language and wrapped in the illusion of kindness. A ritual that did not break chains, but tightened them in ways no iron ever could. To understand what happened that night, we must begin with what Christmas was meant to represent, and how Monticello twisted it into something unrecognizable. At Monticello, Christmas was announced weeks in advance, not as a promise, but as a warning. Extra corn was distributed. Pork rations increased. Children were allowed sweets. A single day was marked on the calendar where labor would slow and voices would be permitted to rise. Overseers called it generosity. Ministers called it Christian duty. But among the enslaved, Christmas carried a different meaning. Inspection. Every smile was watched. Every prayer was measured. Gratitude was not optional, it was required. Former plantation accounts describe Christmas gatherings where enslaved families were ordered to sing hymns before their owners. The songs were familiar, about birth, salvation, and divine love, but the context hollowed them out. These were not prayers offered upward. They were performances offered forward. To refuse was unthinkable. To falter was remembered. Children learned early that Christmas joy had rules. Laugh, but not too loud. Eat, but not too eagerly. Pray, but only the words you were given. And then there were the gifts. Clothes replaced rags. Shoes replaced bare feet. Sometimes a Bible, always already marked with selected passages. These gifts were never owned. They could be taken back at any time. Their purpose was not comfort, but comparison. You are treated well, the ritual said. You have no reason to resist. This was psychological architecture, carefully designed to make suffering invisible by briefly pausing it. Pain, interrupted, becomes harder to name. But the night did not end with hymns. After the visitors left and the candles burned low, elders among the enslaved would gather the children close. They would tell them not to wander, not to sing, not to pray out loud, because Christmas at Monticello was not over when the master slept. That was when the real ceremony began. No official document mentions it, but in oral histories, there is always an hour that does not exist. Between Christmas night and Christmas morning, time itself bends. The enslaved called it the swallowed hour. Bells did not ring. Dogs did not bark. Even infants, it was said, fell silent. Some claimed it was enforced, that overseers locked the quarters and extinguished every flame. Others said no one needed to be forced. By then, the rules were already inside them. During this hour, families were separated, not by walls, but by instruction. Men sent one direction, women another. Children kept where they were told. The explanation given was prayer. Special Christmas prayer, meant to cleanse the spirit before the new year. But no white minister ever attended. What happened in that hour is never described directly. Instead, survivors speak of sensations, of standing in lines they could not see the end of hearing scripture read without warmth, of names being spoken, not shouted, not written, just spoken and then gone. Some remembered being asked questions they did not understand. Others remembered promises being repeated until they felt true. When morning came, no one spoke of it. To speak was to invite separation. To remember too clearly was to disappear into labor crews that never returned home. Christmas ended. Work resumed, and the plantation claimed another year of order. But something had been taken, something that never appeared in any ledger. The first sign was sleep. Children born at Monticello were known to stop dreaming after their fifth or sixth Christmas. Mothers whispered about it in the dark, careful not to let the words travel. The children slept, but without movement, without sound. Nightmares, at least, are a form of rebellion. Dreamless sleep is surrender. Some children began to forget names, not immediately, but gradually. An uncle, a cousin, a sibling sold away years before. Memory thinned, like fabric worn too often. Elders said this was the cost of the Christmas mercy, that each year, something small was taken so the whole could survive. Church records from nearby towns describe enslaved children as remarkably obedient, quiet, untroubled by excess emotion. These were compliments. But among themselves, the enslaved told another story. That Christmas did not free them, it adjusted them, reset them, smoothed the sharp edges of grief just enough to keep the system intact. Monticello did not need chains during Christmas. It needed belief. Belief that suffering had meaning, that obedience was holy, that silence was safety. By the time these children grew into adults, many could no longer explain what they feared about the holiday, only that when December came, their bodies remembered something their minds could not reach. And the mountain waited, because as long as Christmas returned, the ritual could continue, and no one outside ever had to know. At Monticello, the Bible was never read the same way twice. White ministers preached salvation as future reward. But for the enslaved, Scripture was rearranged, verses selected, reordered, repeated until they no longer sounded like faith, but like law. Christmas sermons were the most dangerous of all. They spoke endlessly of birth, not of freedom. Christ was born to serve. Christ obeyed authority. Christ accepted suffering without resistance. The words were delivered softly, almost tenderly. But repetition turns softness into weight. Over years, the message settled into the body like a second skeleton. During the Christmas season, enslaved families were required to attend special night readings. No candles were allowed except the one held by the reader. Faces disappeared into shadow. Only the voice remained. Witnesses later said something unsettling about these readings. The scripture was never explained, only spoken. No discussion, no prayer afterward. Just silence, as if the words themselves were meant to do the work. Some enslaved people believed the verses were chosen to bind rather than teach. Others believed the act of hearing them together, at night, in stillness, was the ritual itself. What made it worse was this. The Bible used for these readings was not the same Bible kept in the house above. Pages were missing. Entire passages, Exodus, liberation, divine wrath, were absent or reordered. Christmas readings focused only on humility, patience, and obedience. It was a holy text turned inward, stripped of escape. And year after year, during that missing hour on Christmas night, the same verses returned, spoken by voices trained not to tremble. Resistance at Monticello did not begin with rebellion. It began with refusal to forget. Around 1811, plantation rumors mention a woman known only as Ruth, an elder midwife whose memory was said to be too sharp. She remembered names others forgot. She remembered children sold away decades earlier. She remembered Africa, not as a place, but as a feeling. That Christmas, Ruth did something small but dangerous. She sang the wrong hymn. While others followed the approved verses, Ruth altered a line, barely noticeable, but intentional. Where the hymn spoke of obedience, she sang of return. Where it spoke of waiting, she sang of crossing. Those nearest to her felt it immediately. A tightening, a fear not of punishment, but of being seen. The overseer did not react. That was the first warning. Because Monticello did not punish resistance openly. It absorbed it. Later that night, Ruth was called away during the swallowed hour. She returned by morning, standing, breathing, but changed. She no longer sang. She no longer corrected names. She no longer spoke of memory. Within a year, she forgot her own. Her silence became a lesson. Historians often ask the wrong question. They ask why the enslaved did not flee during Christmas, when guards relaxed, when food was plentiful, when movement was less restricted? The answer is not fear of capture. It is fear of disorientation. Those who lived through many Christmases at Monticello described a strange weakening of direction. Paths once familiar felt altered. Landmarks lost meaning. Even the stars seemed unreliable. Some believed it was exhaustion. Others believed it was spiritual confusion. But elders whispered a different explanation. The ritual interfered with memory of escape. If you cannot clearly imagine where you are going, freedom becomes abstract. If you cannot hold the image of elsewhere, movement loses purpose. Christmas gave rest to the body, but unsettled the mind. The plantation did not need walls when it could bend orientation itself. And so people stayed, not because they loved their chains, but because the chains were no longer the clearest danger. One of the most unsettling details about Monticello's Christmas ritual is this. The master was never present. Guests left. Overseers withdrew. Even household servants were dismissed early. The plantation appeared to sleep. But the ritual continued. Who led it? No name appears in records. No description survives. Only references to the voice or the reading. Some believed it was an appointed elder forced into compliance. Others believed it rotated yearly. A few believed it was no one at all, that the structure itself had learned how to speak. What matters is not who stood in the dark. What matters is that authority no longer required a visible face. By removing the master from the ritual, Monticello achieved something more efficient than terror, self-enforcement. The enslaved did not obey a man. They obeyed a season. And Christmas came every year. In the county archives, Monticello's Christmas records are pristine. Food distributed. Attendance counted. Hymns listed. No injuries. No deaths. No absences. But tucked between shipment receipts and sermon schedules is a recurring anomaly, small, almost polite. A single line that appears every December for nearly 40 years. Labor resumed at full capacity. Not returned. Not restored. Resumed. As if work had never stopped. As if the holiday itself had not truly existed. One clerk, decades later, added a marginal note beside a Christmas entry from 1823. All present. The ink is heavier, the pressure uneven. Someone was convincing themselves. Because that year, one person did not return by morning. Her name does not appear. Only her absence does. Families noticed before overseers did. A space at the fire. A bowl untouched. A child waiting for a mother who never came back from the swallowed hour. Families noticed before overseers did. A space at the fire. A bowl untouched. A child waiting for a mother who never came back from the swallowed hour. By dawn, the plantation moved quickly. Labor assignments were rearranged. Children redistributed. Questions discouraged, not by threat, but by exhaustion. By noon, the ledger was complete. Monticello did not record disappearance. It recorded continuity. 3 miles from the plantation stood a small white church, used by both free townspeople and enslaved congregations, though never at the same time. Christmas Eve services there were elaborate. Candles, choirs, sermons about divine order. Visitors praised the harmony of the community. What they did not see was the meeting held after midnight, once the townspeople had gone home. Church council notes from the early 1800s mention special seasonal accommodations for nearby estates. The language is vague, almost bureaucratic, but one phrase appears repeatedly. Spiritual alignment. Alignment with what is never stated. Former church caretakers, interviewed generations later, recalled being ordered to lock the doors from the inside during those late-night meetings. No singing. No prayers allowed. Just reading and listening. The same selected scriptures. The same missing passages. The church did not create the Monticello ritual. It legitimized it. By cloaking the swallowed hour in Christian authority, the ritual became untouchable. To question it was not just disobedience, it was heresy. And heresy, in that time, had consequences no ledger would ever admit. She was called Hannah, not because that was her name, but because that was the name people whispered when they needed to remember someone who vanished without permission. Hannah was young, newly married, expecting a child by spring. That Christmas, witnesses say she was calm, unusually calm. She ate little. She did not sing. When the swallowed hour began, she kissed her husband's hand once and followed the instruction without hesitation. She was seen entering the line. She was never seen leaving it. Morning came. The plantation waited. By midday, Overseers claimed Hannah had been reassigned. By evening, her husband was ordered to sleep elsewhere. By the end of the week, her name was no longer spoken aloud. But something changed. That year, the silence lingered longer than usual. Children cried for no reason. Dogs refused to approach the quarters. One man swore he heard singing beneath the ground, soft, unfinished hymns looping without end. Christmas had taken more than it was meant to, and the system noticed. The following Christmas, the ritual was altered. The swallowed hour was shortened. The lines were reorganized. Names were no longer spoken aloud, only counted. Efficiency replaced intimacy. Whatever had happened to Hannah was never allowed to happen again, not because it was cruel, but because it was uncontrolled. Monticello did not fear loss of life. It feared disruption. And so the ritual continued, refined, quieter, safer for the institution. The ledger returned to perfection, all present. But beneath that order, something fragile had been exposed. The ritual could fail. And once a system reveals its dependence on secrecy, its end has already begun. By the 1830s, a generation had come of age at Monticello that had never known a Christmas without the ritual. They had no before to compare it to. These children learned the calendar through sensation, not dates. December meant heaviness in the chest, a tightening behind the eyes, a quiet that arrived days early and lingered long after the candles were gone. When elders tried to explain that Christmas once meant something else, family reunions, laughter without permission, songs chosen freely, the younger ones listened politely, but without recognition. The words described a world that did not feel real. That was the ritual's greatest success. It did not erase memory outright. It made memory unbelievable. Those raised inside the system learned to distrust sudden joy. They learned that gifts preceded loss, that rest carried a price, that kindness always asked for something later. Psychologically, this was containment. If hope itself becomes suspect, resistance loses fuel. Plantation visitors praised this generation as the most stable yet. Fewer attempts to flee, less visible grief, fewer outbursts of rage. But stability is not peace. It is pressure held evenly. Even when the mind submitted, the body did not. Medical journals from nearby towns mention recurring, unexplained symptoms among enslaved people after Christmas: trembling hands, loss of appetite, sudden muteness, dissociative staring. Doctors blamed fatigue. They were wrong. These were trauma responses, ritualized, seasonal, predictable. Some people began to mark their bodies unconsciously. Scratches on the arm, pressure bruises on the wrist, patterns that appeared every December and faded by February. The body was remembering something the mind had been trained to release. One mid-century account describes a man who collapsed every Christmas morning at precisely the same hour. When revived, he could not explain why. He only said, "It's finished again." Again. The ritual did not end when the swallowed hour passed. It echoed. The plantation tried to prevent discussion of the ritual, but memory is not transmitted only through words. Children watched adults stiffen when hymns began. They noticed which elders went silent in December. They felt the fear that had no language. That fear spread, not as panic, but as intuition. One Christmas, a group of children refused to line up. They did not resist loudly. They simply froze. Their bodies stopped responding to instruction. Overseers were confused. Threats did nothing. There was no defiance in the children, only absence. It took hours to restore order. Afterward, the children were separated and sent to different work crews. No punishment was recorded, no lesson announced. But something had shifted. The ritual depended on participation, on movement, on compliance that felt voluntary. For the first time, the system encountered stillness it could not interpret. By the 1840s, Monticello's Christmas ritual no longer worked as intended. It still happened. The swallowed hour remained. The scripture was read. The ledger stayed clean. But the effect had weakened. Some people began dreaming again, vivid, disorienting dreams of water, fire, and roads leading away from the mountain. Others began remembering names without being prompted. And a few, very few, began to talk. Not openly, not in groups, but in fragments passed between generations, disguised as warnings, songs, or half-finished prayers. The ritual had been designed to contain trauma. Instead, it preserved it. And preserved trauma does not disappear. It waits. There is no document that marks the end. No decree. No confession. No acknowledgement that the Christmas ritual at Monticello had ever existed. It simply faded. By the late 1840s, references to special Christmas accommodations grow sparse. Scripture readings shorten. The swallowed hour becomes inconsistent, sometimes skipped entirely, sometimes replaced with ordinary prayer, not because anyone had repented, but because the system no longer needed it. Trauma, once internalized, does not require constant reinforcement. The ritual had already done its work. Generations had learned restraint without supervision. Obedience no longer needed ceremony. And yet, traces remained. Some enslaved people began refusing Christmas food without explanation. Others avoided hymns entirely. A few disappeared during December, not during the ritual, but days later, walking away in silence. The ritual had stopped binding. Now it was loosening. After emancipation, Monticello was remembered as a place of order, intellect, and progress. Christmas stories written later describe benevolent treatment and seasonal kindness. The ritual was rewritten as generosity. The swallowed hour became a rumor, then a superstition, then nothing at all. But trauma does not require belief to survive. Formerly enslaved families carried December unease into freedom. Children raised far from the plantation still grew quiet during Christmas hymns. Some refused church altogether. Others celebrated with intensity that bordered on grief. They did not know why. America did not ask, because asking would have required listening to voices trained for generations not to speak. This story is not absent from history because it lacks evidence. It is absent because it disrupts comfort. Christmas is meant to symbolize hope, mercy, rebirth. To admit that it was used as a tool of psychological domination, to weaponize kindness itself, would mean confronting a deeper truth. That cruelty does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with gifts. Monticello did not need to invent evil. It only needed to ritualize control, cloak it in faith, and repeat it until no one remembered resistance without it. That truth was too unsettling to preserve. So it was buried, not in secret archives, but in plain sight, disguised as tradition. Even now, there are families who grow uneasy when Christmas night deepens, who feel a tightening they cannot explain, who lower their voices instinctively after midnight. They are not remembering events. They are remembering structure. Ritual leaves grooves in human behavior. Trauma leaves patterns in time. The mountain at Monticello still stands. Tourists walk its halls. Carols play. Candles glow. But once a year, in the quiet between night and morning, something familiar returns, not as fear, but as awareness. That celebration can be coerced. That kindness can be conditional. That silence can be enforced so gently it feels chosen. And that the most effective cruelty in American slavery was not always the whip, but the holiday that taught people to thank their captors,